Hey guys, welcome back to episode 2 of what did we call it? Photography Lounge Chats,
PLC for short.
PLC podcast. We're doing these weekly on a Discord server. So if you're watching this anywhere else or listening to it, come join us. The link to the server will be in the show notes, description, anywhere you can find links on the platform you're currently using. Every week, we're going to talk about different topics about photography, videography, all that kind of stuff. We're doing it gradually and getting into stuff that most of us as beginners were wondering about. And we thought we'd cover these most common questions that come up on the Discord server. And so, right now, people are watching us live. There's quite many of you here. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. There is a chat channel. You can find it below the stream. It's called Podcast Chat. You can leave your questions there. There are a few people monitoring the questions. They will pin them and we will get to them as soon as we can. As well as you can hang out with us and talk to us after the show and a different channel that we will jump into and you will see it.
We're muted apparently.
We are.
Yep.
Oh,
Pew pew pew. Let's
sorry,
start
I
again.
forgot to mute.
All right. We're
I
starting
didn't
again?
even notice because I muted it.
I did.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now we are zone.
And action. Try number
Are we
2.
audible now?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
can
yeah.
hear us. All right, hold on. Let me do this. So
Perfect.
don't tell,
Take two.
don't tell anybody. I'm gonna jump to the intro screen and jump back.
Okay.
Let's go.
Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 2 of Photographers Lounge Chats, our weekly podcast. This is the second try. We're live and I messed it up on the first try. Anyways, what I was saying is that this is a weekly show. We're covering topics that usually are a bit confusing to beginners. We were wondering about these when we first started, and we're trying to explain them as best as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, also, these are things that come up in the questions on the Discord server. By the way, if you're watching this anywhere else, you will see this. If you're watching on YouTube, check the description, or if you're listening to the podcast somewhere, check the show notes, and you will find the link to the Discord server where you can come and join us live, leave your questions, and there's plenty of you here. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. If you're watching live right now, notice that there's a podcast chat below the stream. And you can leave your questions there. Eva and Cedric are monitoring the questions. They will be pinning the questions and we'll get to them at the end of the show. Also, you can talk to us personally. We can hear your voice after the show. We will do that in the Talks channel and we can hang out until everybody's sleepy.
Yeah, I think because there were some people asking right now, I think the rule of thumb is if it's a question that is very related to what we're talking in the podcast right now, drop it in the chat. If it's something maybe a bit more sideways of another questions that you might have, maybe leave them for the post Q&A so we can have a more diverse conversation in the post Q&A.
Perfect. So, introduction. My name is Jimmy. You just heard Eva talking. Hi, Eva.
Guys.
And today we're joined by Zivi. Hey, Zivi.
Hello.
How's it going?
Going all right.
It's Zivi's first time on the show today. Last time we had Janet. If you missed that show, it was quite cool. We talked about a lot of things. We covered the exposure triangle, which is, I think, one of the most common things that people
Mhm.
are curious about when they're trying to exit P mode and trying to
Yes.
go into...
I mean, it's the
Yeah.
essential one to know when you're
Yeah.
starting to work on manual and trying to learn a little bit more.
Absolutely. Today, we're going to step it up a little bit. And it's a question that sometimes you think that you can go about your life doing photography without necessarily understanding these topics today. But if you understand them, I think you will have a better understanding of what's happening with your camera. And I think this is a question that I always wondered when I first started is what is millimeter? Why is everything, all the lenses say millimeter on them? You know, it didn't make any sense to me. And I tried understanding it when I first started and I didn't understand anything. But luckily, now I'm a little bit smarter and I kind of get it, so we can try to explain it
Mm-hmm.
today. How about that?
I think it's a cool topic. It can be, a little bit. You have to focus and think about the concepts, but I think it will step up people's game when they really know about this stuff well.
All right, or at least it will kind of eliminate some confusion
Yeah, that for
about the
sure.
whole thing. So let's jump into the slides that we prepared for today's show and see what we have there.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an example of a 50 millimeter lens. Everybody knows what this is. You've seen one of those. It's actually filming me right there. That's a 50 millimeter lens. But what is
Hey,
50?
Me too.
Yeah. It's
Well, mine's a 55,
I think it's the most common one, right?
definitely.
Yeah, and it's but here's the other thing is that what camera are you using, Zivi?
I am using a full-frame Sony camera.
Right. What I'm using over there is a micro four thirds camera.
And here as well.
So how much would you say is the distance between you and your camera, like in meters, approximately?
That's around 2 short person arms, so 120 centimeters.
120.
Maybe?
Yeah. What would you say the distance between me and that camera over there, Eva?
I would say it's about 5 meters.
5 meters between me and there?
No, sorry. What, 2 times me? Maybe less. No, 2 meters something, 3 meters, almost 3 meters. Yeah.
About 3 meters. And we're getting the same.
Wait, I literally have a measuring tape.
Cool. All right. We're now measuring the distance between Zivi and her camera. I should have a measuring tape too. I'm jealous now. What does it say?
102.
102.
So 1
Yeah.
meter.
So 120.
My guess wasn't too far off.
Yeah, it was actually really good. I would say it's about 2 meters between me and that camera over there. I mean, if I
Yeah,
lie
maybe.
down in this distance, I won't reach over there.
No.
And I'm
I
far
was-
from 2 meters.
I know, that's what I mean. That's why I think 3 meters or something. It's about 2 times my height.
Yeah, so I would say, well, actually, here's the thing. Knowing how far Zivi's camera from her right now,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that we are using the same lens,
Yeah.
knowing the crop factor, I
Yeah.
can precisely tell you that that camera is 2 meters and 40 centimeters away from me.
Wizard.
Right?
You're a wizard.
How did I do that? Well, we're going to find out today.
You're a wizard, Jimmy.
Totally. None of this was planned.
No.
All right. And the reason is because there's a thing called crop factor. And you hear a lot about this. But in order to understand, we need to first start to understand what the lens is.
What does it mean that a lens is 50 millimeters?
Sorry, I was telling myself I shouldn't click that button accidentally, and I did click it before the stream. All right. So here we're looking at an example of a camera and what happens on the inside. And this here, right here, it's called an optical center of the lens, which means that's where all the light comes in to become a single point, and then it goes back out as a projection.
And it is the point where it converges.
Exactly. But
Yes.
what does it mean is that the light comes in
Yeah.
and then it starts again outside.
Yeah, they all go to exactly one point. So this, for people that might be familiar of when you use a magnifying lens to burn something because you put it under the sunlight and then the sunlight gets concentrated into one point and then projected out, and that's why you can actually burn stuff using a magnifying lens with the sunlight.
Mhm.
That's the point where the light basically all comes together and becomes very powerful,
Mhm.
and then on the other side it will start diffusing again.
Right. So what the focal length is, or basically millimeter as we call it, is the distance between this point and every different lens. So every different lens this point is gonna be somewhere else in proportion to the lens. So this is a different lens, for example. The focal point or the focal center might be in the front, might be in the back, might be exactly in the center. Here's another lens. So this one is a much bigger lens. And also, there's multiple areas anywhere here. I don't know the design of this lens, but it could be anywhere inside.
I mean, generally, a lens for a camera, it doesn't have just one glass element, which is what the magnifying lens has. It only has one. So it has different elements, and they all work together to converge the image into one point and then project it into your sensor.
Exactly. Here we can see in this example photo, we have 3 of them. one in the front, one in the middle, and one in the back. And you can see there are different types. Probably many of you already know this, but it's important to understand that there's a single point where all the light converge, and that is the focal center. And the distance from that point to the sensor of your camera is called a focal length.
That's why the focal length is a property of the lens
itself. It doesn't affect the camera. It's all about the lens. That's why the lenses are named that way. So I can tell you something. This lens, for example, is a 80 millimeter lens. This is an 80 millimeter. And this lens actually is made for a medium format camera.
Film medium format.
Yeah. And actually, when I look through the camera using this one, it looks almost exactly the same as what I see when I look through a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera. What is that all about?
This is because the sensors are different and the sensors have different sizes.
Right. So basically what's happening inside when the image is going through the lens, it's going out as a circle on the other side. It's not a rectangle as we see it. And so when it goes in, usually the circle of the light coming out of the lens should cover the whole sensor, basically. Sometimes it doesn't.
Then we get into trouble.
Right. So.
But a lens that is made to fit a specific camera, the image circle that lens projects into the sensor will cover the whole sensor of that camera. That's basically the definition of why that lens is working in that camera.
Right. I think we can show this in real time, right? If you can turn on the Canon that you have over there.
Yeah. So what we have prepared here, it's full frame camera, which we're gonna talk about what full frame actually means. But let's just say this is a full frame Canon camera. And what I have put into it is an old lens that I have from my old Canon camera, which was a crop sensor camera. It was the 70D. So this is a Canon 6D, and I had a 70D before, and I didn't get rid of the lens yet. So it's very, very handy for today. So when I turn it on, and I show you what it sees.
All right, let me see if we can see what you're seeing.
As in my toes.
Oh.
But what you can see here, guys, is that yes, you are still seeing an image, right? You're seeing it, the center is fine, and then as it comes out to the edges, you will start to see a heavy vignetting. And this heavy vignetting is coming because the image circle that this lens is projecting onto my sensor in this full frame camera is too small to cover the whole sensor.
Can you film this? So you can see how wide this field of view is. So I need to mention that both of these lenses, so this lens right here, this is what is pointing at Eva, and you can see her in the screen. It's a 35 millimeter lens. And the lens that she's holding in her hand is a 30 millimeter lens. So they're only 5 millimeter different. It shouldn't be noticeable. The reason why you see this much further away than when you see on the other view, this view right here, is because we're using a micro four thirds camera as well over there.
Which has a small sensor.
But now, let's talk about this. You see those black circles around the image? This is exactly what's causing them. It's exactly what you can see here. In this example over here. This is exactly what's happening. The image circle is too small to cover the entire sensor. And that's why we see the vignetting in Eva's camera.
And
do you want me to switch back to the view?
Yes, because now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna change from this lens, which I said is a lens that is made for a crop factor Canon camera. I'm gonna change into a lens that is made for a full frame Canon camera, and I'm gonna set it up at the same focal length, so you guys can see how it changes.
All right, let's see that.
So we have this, and then this.
Dun 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 dun. We should have some music track. I think I have something.
Okay, here it is. It's very bad at autofocusing, actually. Here. Very mysterious.
All right, so what happened there?
So now it's full frame lens, put a 30 millimeter. So now we are recovering all that lost part of the sensor.
So basically what you're saying that this lens that you just put in has a bigger image circle.
Yes.
It makes a bigger projection of light.
Yes, even though it's the same focal length.
All right. I think I understand.
Mm-hmm. How are the people out there listening to us? Do you guys follow up what we're talking about? Just leave us some comments on the chat too.
What do you think, Zivi? Are you more confused or less confused about this whole thing?
I mean, I happen to already know these things, so I don't really know if I can be more confused about them.
Right.
But yeah, it does make sense.
All right. So, and if you can you point it back at this camera? So now at this one over here. You see?
Yeah,
This is a much clearer view. You can see that this one is significantly more zoomed out. So these are two cameras are
Jimmy's in frame.
Yeah. Hello. And so like you see this one is so much bigger, the one that Eva is holding in her hand,
Yeah.
while this one is almost like a zoom lens. Because actually, what's the crop factor for this camera? Let's talk about that.
So before we move on to the crop factor topics, on the chat there is someone that is asking. Yes, I'm convinced actually. So we have convinced them that this is actually how it works.
Mission
Yay for us! But then they are asking like how to know the focal center. You don't need to worry about the focal center of your lens. This is something that is intrinsic, is a characteristic of your lens, and the only thing that you have to know is what is the focal length of your camera, and it will say of your lens, and it will say on the lens, right, on the front generally or on the side.
That's what the lens is, but that's what the name. So
and then what you need to
example.
know is what kind of camera do you have, what kind of sensor does your camera have, in case that you want to do some conversions to understand how the field of view is going to change.
So for example, now we have an example photo of a scene and how it will look like if you use the same lens but on a different camera. So here it doesn't specify which lens it is. Let's assume this is a 50 millimeter.
Looks roughly like a 28 to be honest.
I was gonna say 28, but I don't want.
It's a 28
I know. I was just like keeping it simple. It's a 28
because
right? It's a wide angle.
When you put it in full frame, it's a wide angle. Yeah.
Yes. So here we have a full frame, and full frame is the most common sensor size, at least in professional cameras.
Yes.
So like if you're buying the top,
it's the most well-known.
Yeah. So if you're buying the flagship Nikon, the flagship Canon, flagship Sony, all of these are gonna have a full frame sensor. That's what they're known as. APS-C is usually the second biggest one, and it's also provided by Canon and Nikon. They have all of the entry levels cameras are APS-C. Fuji,
the old Fujis also.
I think all of them.
All of the Fujis, actually, yeah, you're right.
Fuji only makes APS-C and medium format.
Yeah,
yes,
true.
That's true.
Well, that's questionable since they're not that large.
Well, it's it's digital medium format, and
we can talk about that.
We will get to that in a minute. And then we have micro four thirds. You see it; it's the blue one over here, and this is the one that actually me and Eva right now are being filmed with. We're using a sensor size that is the same as the blue one, while Zivi is using the same as the yellow one. And here's the thing: if you noticed, Eva was holding in her hand the 6D, which is also the yellow frame, while she's being filmed with a blue frame. So that's why when I was telling you, you see the difference between the two cameras. Can you switch the camera back on, please?
Yeah, so I can put it in 35, which is the same.
Yes. So now we're gonna do a live comparison between a yellow one and a blue one. If we look at this screen, right? So actually, let me jump into this one. So you can see the difference. Eva is being filmed with a blue frame lines, micro four thirds, and she's holding in her hand. So me, basically, I'm being framed with the yellow or a full frame camera using the exact same focal length. You can see how much different it is. You can see how small this camera looks in the frame, how big that camera looks in her frame, in her hand, in the frame that she's in. I think this is a fairly clear representation.
If something is unclear, please just let us know in the chat, and then we can explain things maybe in a different way.
All right, and we're back to this view. So, any questions in the chat so far?
Nothing yet. Neurals is asking if is it the same aperture. We cannot answer that question precisely because the lens that we have. This is gonna be interesting. The lens that we have in that camera, which is the Micro Four Thirds camera that is filming me, is a 35mm lens. That is a Canon lens. So the aperture is not set by the camera that is actually holding it right now. It's set by the last aperture I had in my Canon 6D before I took it off to put it in the other one. So I'm not sure what aperture it is. I think it probably is about 2.8, 3.2 or something like that. And here I was shooting
it's very shallow actually.
Yeah. I mean, I think this one, this is a 4.5 right now, which is maximum aperture at this focal length.
Because it's a zoom lens.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that...
Yeah, and there's the 1-inch sensor too, which is... there's a couple drones that have those, and otherwise it's in point-and-shoot cameras.
Absolutely.
Most point-and-shoot cameras actually have even smaller sensors than that, but there are a few that have 1-inch sensors.
We have another
I think there
another
was
slide where we can see all the sizes compared.
Was there a phone with a 1-inch sensor?
Oh.
Did they ever make that? I think somebody made a phone.
I think it was a concept, but I know Huawei made a phone with a large sensor.
Yeah, if it's something, it's gonna be the Chinese.
It wasn't 1-inch though.
Okay. All right. Here's the cool... I'm gonna have to say this. So you're saying most point-and-shoot digital cameras are using a 1-inch sensor, right? How about this? This one right here is a film camera, and it's very inexpensive and very automatic. It only has one button, and it actually shoots full frame. This is a full frame camera.
I think it's good if you pull out now the size comparisons with all the sizes, so we can talk about that specifically.
I just want to plug my favorite camera. Sorry.
It's good. You can show it still at the same time, because this is a very interesting concept.
So here, is this what you're talking about?
No, the one that is with squares, a lot of squares. More.
This one.
The other one.
This one.
That one.
All right. So what are we looking at here?
So what we're looking at here is actually size comparisons of actually the sizes of the sensors. From the very small one, which is 1/2. So it's less than an inch.
So that's probably the most common one for phones.
The phones
the green one.
The tiny one that you see there. And then going up and up and up. And then you have the 4/3 sensors, which is also Micro Four Thirds. Before it was 4/3.
One of those small ones should be bridge cameras.
Yeah, yeah, actually.
Absolutely, yeah. That's actually very.
They have teeny tiny sensors.
There is this camera called Nikon Coolpix 1000X or something like that.
The one that can go super fast.
Isn't it 1000p? I don't know.
I think so, and it zooms.
Yeah,
so
it has
far
a 3000mm lens.
And it has a directional.
Is it 3000mm or is
I
it?
think it's 3000.
I don't think the lens is that big. I think the fact is that they use a tiny sensor inside. And when you zoom in, so it's like a 300mm, let's say, but then it's a 300.
It might be like a 300.
Because what's the crop factor from 35mm to 2/50th of an inch? 2/50th? How do you say this number? The green small one.
2.5.
2.5.
2.5 of an inch.
That's like a 1/4 inch, basically.
A 1/4 inch.
Yeah. So a quarter should be 1/4.
Look at us Europeans trying to figure out inches.
Right? I think if I can... it's impossible to understand this. I think, it's about...
Yeah, it is 3000.
It's a 3000mm.
Yeah.
I just looked it up. It's a 24 to 3000mm 35mm equivalent.
Equivalent.
Yes.
That's the key word, is the equivalent.
But it's not an effective 3000.
No.
So what are we talking about? We're talking about, because 3000mm is 300 centimeter, which is 3 meters basically.
Yeah.
So if you say a lens is 3 meter
between the focal point and the sensor,
so it has to be
it's
big.
a 4.3 to 539mm.
That makes more sense. So there is 50 centimeters. What? 500. So there's 50 centimeters. No, that doesn't make sense either.
And the image sensor is 1 by 2.3 inches? 1 over 2.3 inches? So it's even smaller than the smallest one over here.
That's why it can go so far in, because the smaller the sensor, the more zoom in effect you're gonna have at a given focal length.
Because if we look back at this, so what are we talking about? All this mess. What does it mean? If we look back at this screen here, we have, as we said, a 28 millimeter lens.
Mm-hmm.
But that's if we're talking about the yellow frames. When you say 28 millimeter, in everybody's head, it's a wide angle.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody understands what a lens looks like when it's on a full frame.
Or that's the reference point.
Yeah. So because it's the most common, when you say, okay, I want a fairly wide angle, a 28 millimeter is going to look like the yellow framing lines, which is fairly wide, right? It's not a fisheye. It's not ultra wide, but it's fairly wide.
It's natural wide.
Yeah. It's before stuff start to look weird. So, but if you take that same lens, right, and you put it on a smaller sensor, in this case, let's talk about micro four thirds. Now you're talking the field of view or the image that you see is twice as much, because this blue line is exactly
twice as small.
Twice as small.
Yeah, but I mean twice as small.
Little, yeah.
Yeah. So the blue line is exactly half the area of the yellow one, meaning that if we want to have a yellow frame that looks like the blue frame, we need to take a lens. Instead of being a 28 millimeter, it has to be 56. Wait, 56.
14. Because
14.
14, you are zooming in.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So a 14 millimeter.
No. You're not understanding what I'm saying. Or are you? I think
so.
What I was saying is that if you want to have the same field of view of the blue line on a yellow line.
Yeah, the other way around, then yes.
Right.
So there's two way of conversion, right? If you want to have a more zoom in feeling on a full frame, you have to have a longer focal length. So from 28 you will go to 52. But if you want to have on a micro four thirds sensor or camera a more wide angle of view, you have to have a shorter focal length. So from a 28 you need a 14.
All right, so I think we can show this precisely what it is. 35 is what we're using on this camera. Over there, when you had a 35, it was much wider.
Yes.
How would you match that 35 on this one?
Okay, so because I know that the crop factor of that camera over a full frame sensor is 2 times, as we say, 2 times smaller or bigger, depending which way we're converting. A 35 millimeter lens in that camera is actually a 70 millimeter equivalent to 35 millimeter sensor, full frame sensor. So to match the exact same field of view in both cameras, and here I have a zoom lens, what I would do is to put this lens at a 70 millimeter.
Exactly.
And then we should have the same field of view in both cameras.
Right. Let's do that. You're already live.
Yes. This would be it.
So now it's about the same crop on each lenses. It's the same feeling. It's the same field of view.
Field of view, yes.
But in order to achieve that, the Canon camera that is Eva is holding is on 70 millimeter, which is twice the 35 millimeter in this camera over here. I think this should kind of clarify.
What do you think, CV? Is this clear enough?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Maybe try to zoom back out.
Yes.
Just to illustrate it.
So this is a 35 millimeter in full frame. And then to get how a micro four thirds camera would see a 35 millimeter lens, I just double the focal length.
I'm going to put my head in the frame for reference as well.
Okay. Wait. This is a 35. And then if I want, let me focus on you. And then if I want to see how would my micro four thirds camera would look like with a 35 millimeter lens, I have to actually go to 70 millimeter lens. Here, 70 millimeter zoom. this is actually, when people are starting out, this is very confusing, and it leads to a lot of problems for two reasons. Actually, the thing about the image circle being too small, it happens a lot of times when people upgrade from crop factor cameras to their equivalent same brand full frame. So there's a ton of people shouting in Facebook groups when they go from a 70D Canon to a 6D Canon, what happened to my lens? It's not working anymore, my camera is broken. No, you need to understand that that lens is made for a crop sensor camera. It's not gonna work out on your full frame camera. And then the other thing that is very confusing is everyone knows that the holy grail of focal length to work and to learn is a 50mm lens, right? And it's like, oh, I want a 50mm 1.4 lens. So a creamy bokeh, so nice. And then they have a crop sensor camera because they're cheaper, and they start with that.
So, for example, like
A
Canon
Canon.
Rebel,
Yeah, Canon Rebel, or I guess the Nikon's
Nikon
3000
something
something.
like that.
Yeah, and then they get a 50mm lens for that camera.
Mhm.
And then when they put it on, actually it's not an effective 50mm lens.
It's much more zoomed in.
It will be zooming by whatever crop factor that camera has. And if you want, we can show now the table that we have.
So I think here it's exactly the relationship between the yellow line and the red line.
Exactly.
So if you buy,
I got very surprised when I switched from an APS-C sized Canon camera
Mhm.
to a full frame Sony camera, and I was using the usual 50mm 1.8 on the Canon camera,
Nifty
Yes.
50.
and then I bought myself a nice 50,
Mhm.
still 1.8,
yeah.
but it's a very nice one
And now you-
that I'm using right now,
Mhm.
and it is a lot wider.
Right?
Yes.
It's
And
it's the same lens. It just feels wider.
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
also because it's important for people to understand this, because when they look at reference photos, when they learn from other photographers, and they are like curious, oh, what lens did this person use, or this photographer, and then it's like, oh yeah, it's a typical 50mm portrait or whatever. And then you actually have a 50mm lens in your crop sensor camera, and then you're like, I'm not getting the same feel of view. Why it doesn't look the same? This is the reason why.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So now we're
Now that
looking.
I know more about this stuff, I bought a new APS-C camera, and I wanted to match the focal length.
All right.
So I like shooting with a 24 and a 50 on my full frame camera.
So they look the
so-
same or close, kind of.
This is a full frame lens, and then there's a teeny tiny APS-C lens.
So what
And
are
this is a 16mm
a
to match
16?
the 24mm because it's a 1.5 times crop factor, like you can see on the chart.
Right. So here you're talking about the APS-C
Yeah.
Canon, and it's
Full frame.
1.61.
Yeah, 1.6, which is approximately
So if you take a 16 and
Yeah.
you multiply,
by 1.6.
what will you get?
A 16mm,
Mm-hmm.
1.6
Well,
times
Which is 1.5, I
16.
think.
Yeah, 25.6.
25.6. And
Yeah.
the full frame camera you're using is a
Fuji should be 1.5.
So yeah, that's a really good example.
Yeah, it's an important piece of concept to know and understand when deciding what lens to buy, what is it that you like, how things look.
So basically, what you need to do is, if you look at this chart over here,
Mm-hmm.
and you can tell, okay, so I have a micro four thirds camera, for example, or I have a APS-C, Canon, or Nikon. You look at whatever one you have. You're probably not gonna be looking at these two, the medium format, and these are confusing, and we'll talk about them in a bit, because this is not necessarily referring to anything specific.
Yeah, it's a bit
It's
abstract.
It's very general. These last two. So
Medium format digital cameras are weird.
yeah, there is no standard basically for those things. The useful stuff ends here on full frame, especially if you're shooting digital.
Yeah.
So-
Actually, ignore APS-H.
Yeah, this one. What
Yeah,
is this
just
one? I don't know. I remember this one.
That is the Canon 1D cameras,
Oh,
not the
I-
1DX.
Okay.
yeah, okay.
So
Those have APS-H sensors, which is whatever that 1.7 something.
all right. So
1.3.
all right. So unless you have one of these, also ignore that.
I mean, the most common are, yeah, Micro
Micro
Four
Four
Thirds
Thirds.
APS-Cs for Nikon, Canon, almost same thing. It's a little bit different,
All
as you
right.
can see there.
So
And
what
then
you
full
need.
frame.
So basically, how is this useful? Let's say you have a Canon Rebel, and you want to have a 50 millimeter field on your camera, a 50 millimeter field of view. So when we're saying 50 millimeter, we're talking about if we grab a lens that says 50 millimeter on it, and we put it on a full frame camera. That's what it means. When
Yes.
everybody says 50 millimeter equivalent, now we're not going to be confused anymore.
No.
It means a 50 millimeter lens on a full frame camera.
Yes.
So you need to use the crop factor number
To divide.
and that will tell you, okay, then you need to use this number millimeter to get the same field of view. And sometimes you might not find it exactly.
Yeah, so this is exactly what happened to me when I got my 70D, because I knew I wanted a 50 millimeter lens, but I knew I'm not gonna use the 50 because the 50 won't be really a 50 in my camera. So I got the one that I just showed you guys, which is a Sigma lens, which is a 30 millimeter 1.4.
All right.
So a 30 millimeter 1.4, it's almost equivalent to a 50 millimeter on a full frame.
All right. So if you take 30 and you multiply it by 1.6.
Yes. So what you get is a whooping 48.
48. So it's very close.
It's very close.
Almost, negligible, the difference.
Yes.
Like 2-3 millimeters, you don't notice that.
Yeah.
No.
And with cropping and all that stuff, it's going to give you almost exactly the same
I
feeling.
really loved that lens when I was shooting with my 70D.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I got the 6D, the first lens I got, it was the Nifty 50, which is a 50 millimeter 1.8 for full frame.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that we didn't really mention, but I think is kind of implicit, is you cannot use lenses made for crop sensor cameras in full frames, because then you get this image circle that's smaller. But you can do the opposite with no problem. So you can use a Canon lens that is made for a full frame camera. It gives you a big image circle. Then you can use that one on a crop sensor camera, because it already covers the sensor.
Exactly. So here on the slide we're looking at, the sensor is usually rectangle, obviously, and the circle of light is falling on it. It has to cover it. So in this case, in this example, this is an image circle designed specifically to fit that sensor. In this case, is as we showed you with the Canon old lens or like crop sensor lens on a full frame, you get vignetting on the side. However, there's this third example that is not being shown here, and that's where the image circle is a lot bigger than the sensor. So imagine a much bigger circle around this.
Which it doesn't really matter. You are losing some field of view, but still you are going to be able to use it. And since the cameras have the same mount, you can use your so you have virtually a lot of possibilities when you have a crop sensor camera, because you can fit the lenses that come from the full frames and the lenses that are for the crop sensor.
So like, for example, that lens that is filming me and the one that is filming Eva has a much bigger circle.
Yes.
Because these lenses are made for full frame cameras, but instead of the full frame, there's a tiny Micro Four Thirds, about half the size. So imagine, let's see if I can draw. So this right here is my sensor inside the camera, and the image circle is the gray circle outside, and the white rectangle is the sensor that the lens was designed for. So that's why it's much more zoomed in over there. It's much more zoomed in on Eva's camera. While Zivi, for example, her field of view, her sensor is fitting precisely like this inside the image circle that her lens is being is casting, basically.
I think
Perfectly balanced.
I think all these concepts are useful when, we all have a little bit of gear acquisition syndrome. So then when you really understand these numbers, then you are thinking, oh, maybe I can get this kind of lens for my camera if I find an adapter because it's a different brand or something like that. So I think it is really useful to have this like pinned down.
Of course, like you can utilize different lenses, old lenses, analog lenses,
Vintage lenses.
vintage lenses. You can
Most vintage lenses will cover full frame.
Yeah.
Actually,
Maybe we should talk about that. Yeah.
where is it?
I mean, that kind of is where the full frame
Yeah.
term even comes from.
I was talking about this one, earlier, this is a Mamiya 645 lens, and it's an 80 millimeter 2.8. This lens has a sibling that is called the Mamiya 80 millimeter 1.9, and it's the fastest medium format lens. And now good luck finding it, because all the cinema people discovered how beautiful that lens is, and they use it basically on cinema cameras,
Yeah.
like on Aries and stuff like that. They just adapt this lens
Because a
or
lens is
the
a
other
lens.
one.
And if it's a good lens, it's a good built lens with good glass, and you
Yeah.
are able to adapt it to any of the digital sensors nowadays. It's you may be losing the autofocus, but sometimes that's not important.
Right, exactly. I mean, in cinema they always usually have a focus.
In cinema, they never use autofocus.
Yeah,
Yeah, they
Otherwise,
use,
the autofocus pros would be out of a job.
yeah. That's true.
true.
I mean, I think eventually everybody is going to be
Out of jobs.
out of jobs with automation.
In cinema, it is a thing to take vintage lenses and rehouse them.
Yeah,
Mm?
yeah. We were watching a documentary about what was it? Shooting on what Tarantino does. What is it? The super big format.
Oh, when he did the Hateful Eight.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you haven't seen there, like look up the Hateful Eight and how it was.
Was that shot on IMAX?
Yeah.
It was
shot
modified IMAX.
70 millimeter.
I know that Nolan uses medium format Hasselblad lenses.
Yeah,
For
some-
these are great as well. A lot of cinema, like directors and stuff like that, they do use these lenses because they're really, really, really nice.
Shooting in IMAX is also a niche. There's like 3 IMAX cameras in the world.
Yeah, but still, it's all you need. You only need one.
Yep.
You know? And we can get into this discussion about my feelings on IMAX. Obviously, I love it, but
It's fun.
it is really nice. And the thing with IMAX is that you can shoot it in different ways, or not IMAX, but the same film can be shot in 2 different ways. So if you shoot it one way, it's called 65 millimeter, and if you shoot it sideways, it's called IMAX.
Yeah, because it's bigger.
And it's usually a strip of film that is running. It's just that if you're exposing it on the short side or on the long side,
Yeah.
that's the
If
main
any of you guys that are listening are interested in having a more in-depth and visual explanation of these filming things, I can highly recommend looking at the media division on YouTube.
yeah,
Make
really cool
some
channel.
make some really good YouTube videos with explanations of some very technical niche things that nobody really needs to know, but they're really fun.
Are they the one who tried to do a 4x5 cinema camera?
Yeah, I think so.
I
They-
saw
they-
that video. They put together the...
They moved the lens on a actually they put the 4x5 lens, and then they
Yeah,
moved the sensor
used-
around to film the. They
They
usually
used the full frame camera, then they moved around.
yeah.
I think they used one of those the Chinese company that makes 8K cameras.
Right.
So they filmed in 16K.
They always do the this movie projector. That's their subject when they're filming. Right.
Yeah.
Really
It's
beautiful.
the
stuff.
test subject.
Yeah. Actually, we can do an explanation here on what's going on. So basically, you can see here, this is a sensor, the gray part, and the yellow part is an image circle. And obviously here, this is, let's say, a lens made for full frame, and we're using something like some kind of a crop sensor on it. That's why we have a lot of the image circle outside of the sensor.
The yellow part, yeah.
The yellow part. Here, this is a bigger sensor and the image circle fitting.
Perfectly.
But then here, that's why you see only a part of the image. So what this people do that Zivi mentioned, media division, right? What they do is that they have this lens and they're moving a repeating subject, which is a movie projector that is just rolling and emitting light.
It's a static scene.
Yeah, so
That's all
it's
that really
repeating.
matters.
It doesn't, yeah. And what they do is that they record, like they move the sensor up to the top, record, let's say 5 seconds, put it down, record 5 seconds, move it here, record 5 seconds,
Basically,
move it up,
Moving
record
around.
5 seconds. And
You create an effective, much bigger sensor than what it actually the sensor is,
yes,
which is very similar, I think.
to
Yeah.
tilt shift.
Yeah, the tilt shift, and also I was thinking the high resolution of the Micro Four Thirds, because they're using
Yeah.
a very small sensor. It kind of moves around. So I think there are two.
I mean, any high res mode, to be honest.
Oh,
Yeah, the same one you have, Zivi, as well in your camera.
Yeah, medium format cameras have that too.
Yeah, the Fuji
GX.
FG something, the
something.
medium format Fuji.
I know that the Hasselblad and Phase ones do too.
Yeah, but these already also come in with like 200 megapixel sensors.
Well, yeah. Do you
What if
wanna
what
talk
if you want
megapixels?
800 megapixels?
Go see go see a professional
Go
about
see a
your mental health. Yeah, I was gonna say that when people use stitching for interior, like what do you call it? Like
Interior
shots?
design
No,
or
interior shots.
Yeah.
What do you call it?
Interior
Real estate.
Real estate. Thank you.
photography. Yeah.
So they have these really wide, really big. What do you call it? Pictures capturing a very big field of view.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they're doing that is more instead of moving the sensor. Sometimes they move the sensor, and sometimes they move the lens
The camera, yeah.
or
Mhm.
the lens. If you're using a
yeah, true, that's
a
true.
tilt shift adapter or a tilt shift lens, you can use the shift function in that lens. And what you do is basically move the image circle around. And when you move the image circle, this part moves, but also this part moves. So whatever the lens is looking at,
Mhm.
so you're moving it and it captures a part of the scene. You move it to the side and it captures the other side of the scene. You move it up, you move it down, and that way you can capture a much bigger image
Mhm.
by moving the image circle around the sensor.
This is the tips and tricks of like knowing what the lens basically does with an image and with the light that it comes into it.
Yep.
All right. Here we have a size comparison on the other end of the formats that are
Mhm.
available.
Yeah, because I mean, CB, was actually mentioning that 35mm is called full frame in digital because where it comes from,
Mm-hmm.
but it's to my standards not very full, and this is what it actually shows.
So in analog world, this is a full frame or a 35mm, which is, I think, there are two sensors or like two sizes below this, half frame, which is exactly half,
Mm-hmm.
and 110 millimeter, which is very tiny, and you don't want to. I don't know if you guys remember, there was these cameras that you hold like this. They look like a chocolate bar,
Super thin.
and you like take a photo like this. That was the smallest
I
thing.
think our audience here is pretty young.
Yeah. I have an example here to show you.
It's too ancient for me too.
Yeah, it is. It's another century, right?
I'm looking for a 90mm lens.
Did you get it?
No, I can't find it. I think it's over there, but it's fine. This is similar enough. So this is a 65mm lens, medium format 65mm lens, and this is
Chonky.
an 80mm. But these are two different formats in medium format.
Mm-hmm.
You can see on the screen, right above 35mm, you have 645, 6x6, 6x7, 6x9. And this one is 645, and this one is 6x7. So you can see how much different they are. The reason is because this lens needs to cast a bigger image circle.
Because it's gonna be used in a bigger part of the film you're
Yes.
using.
So the camera that is holding on to this is a much bigger camera than the camera holding on to this, because also it needs to fit that sensor.
Mm-hmm.
So the sensor size is also directly correlated to the camera size. You can't
Yeah.
have a tiny camera, let's say, with a full frame sensor. There is limitation. You can always, like with a digital point and shoot, if you want to go smaller, you kind of have to shrink the sensor size.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to go bigger, sometimes you reach a limit and you need to increase the size of the camera to fit the size of a sensor. And you might notice as well that here on this comparison 6x6 and 6x7, 6x9, these are all using
The same type of film.
all of these cameras right here, they use the same film, and the only difference is that how the orientation and how much of the film is exposed. And that's a nice thing about film, is that you have a lot of versatility when you're shooting different formats. You buy the same film and you can shoot it in multiple different formats.
As long as the camera allows for exposing more film and the lens as well with the
Right.
image circle.
And here we get into something called large format. These are huge. There is one common that is still being used today above this, and it's 8 inches by 10 inches, which is basically like
Double.
a size of an A4 paper. And
The
that would,
lenses get super weird when you get to those sizes.
They're huge.
It's like a
yeah, especially
500 something millimeter.
yeah, and often, you know what, Zivi, they're measured in centimeters.
Because it's too long.
You know, like because 300, well, instead
30.
of 300 millimeter, you
30
say
centimeter.
30 centimeter.
Yeah.
A lot of old lenses are measured in centimeter,
Yeah.
and then the change there in what you understand or what you imagine is going to be a lot bigger even.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say I want a 50 millimeter field of view on a micro four thirds.
Yeah.
I will use a 25,
A 25.
exactly half.
Yeah.
But let's say I want to use a 50 millimeter equivalent from a 35 millimeter on a
Mhm.
medium format. Well, the first question is, what is your
Crop factor?
not your crop factor, but your frame? What
Yeah.
type of frame are you using?
Yeah, exactly.
Are you using 645
I use
or are you using 6x9? Because it will change between these.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you go up to 4x5, it also
Yeah, it's the same reason as the different digital sensors that we were talking. You
Mhm.
have the APS-C, you have the Micro Four Thirds, or you have the 1 inch. All those are different.
approximately, if I remember correctly, when I
Mhm.
had a 4x5 for a while, it's a 50 millimeter equivalent. So if you want to put a lens on this one and call it a 50, and you want the same field of view on this one, it's 150.
The 4x5?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's 150.
150. It
So
will
it's
give
3
you
times,
yeah,
but the other way.
Yeah.
Instead of multiply, it's divided.
yeah. And I think the 150 was slightly a bit wider than a normal 50.
Uh-huh.
But from the common lenses that exist, the 150 is the closest thing to a 50.
I mean,
mean-
it is a different aspect ratio too.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
And by aspect ratio, you mean is if you're unfamiliar with that, is the relationship between this side and this side.
Yeah, one side over the other side.
Yeah. So is it a square? Is it a rectangle? Is it a very thin rectangle or very long
Panorama. Mhm.
panorama? All of these are different aspect ratios. The thing here in medium format, basically, you can see it very visually clear. 6x6, 6x7, 6x9. These are all different sizes, but also aspect ratios. This one is most rectangle. This one is almost a square. This is a perfect square.
That's where Instagram comes from. Originally, Instagram only had 1-to-1 ratio photos.
That is true.
And then they actually thought like, oh, not everybody's shooting that kind of photos, so we're going to include the portrait and the landscape as well. So, yeah, I remember those times when it was only a square.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
we haven't talked about bokeh at all.
we will get to it in, I think, the last two slides, because that's directly related to the lens. And I will show you a few lenses that I have laying around here. So this is a 127 millimeter. On the camera that this is used for, it's approximately a 50 millimeter.
It's a 6x7.
This is 6x7. So it's approximately the same as an 80 millimeter on a 645.
I think people are like, their brains are like, boo, numbers.
Yeah. And this one is an 180 millimeter. This is a portrait lens.
Mhm.
This is not a birding lens. It's 180 millimeter. It's a portrait lens.
It's just a little chunky.
Yes, the reason for that is that it's beautiful. That's the reason. There's no more reasons needed. It's one of my favorite lenses, the Mamiya 180 millimeter.
Mhm.
And here we have a chunkier one. So in comparison, you can see both. This one is a 250 millimeter. And only here is when we start to get a telephoto feel to it. I don't know what's the equivalent on this, but it's more zoomed in than a portrait lens. So if I'm trying to run around after Animals, I'm probably going to use this one or a bigger one or longer one, or maybe add some extension tubes to this one.
Or social distancing photo shoots.
That is true as well. Actually, I did use it for portraits. This one, it was pretty crazy, and I think that's where we can talk about the relationship between the focal length and depth of field.
Yes. To make it a little bit more complicated.
Yes, because why not?
So, I think these examples can kind of show you what I mean by that. So here we have two pictures.
First, before we start, is that a very, 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 very big lens or a very, 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 very small trombone?
I think it's a giant lens,
I
normal
think it's
size
both.
trombone. I would
I
like
think
to,
it's both.
right? I would like
It's a
to.
dwarf-sized trombone, and it's some sort of obscure giant format lens that nobody knows about.
Oi, interesting.
Made by Sigma, apparently.
Yeah, it looks like a Sigma lens. I can see
It's
that.
a Sigma-Eric lens.
Who took these photos?
Stevie?
Oh,
No,
No? I thought you did. Okay.
Janet took them from the
For
internet.
Janet. Okay.
All right.
Because, I know that Stevie, you do things with music. So I was like, maybe it was you.
I planned on doing it, but then time happened.
Yeah.
all right. I'm trying to zoom in without necessarily.
I do have some, though. From
What?
another time.
I can't show them right now without messing up this whole assembly.
Oh, both of
And I
them.
can't send them right now because I'm on Windows to make the camera work.
Oi, oi, oi.
Crazy. So here the example is, I think it's quite clear. I don't know how clear it is for you guys. The bottom lens or the bottom picture, this one is 100 millimeter and it's at f4. And this one is a 200 millimeter at f4. I don't know if you can see it, but you see these numbers over there. They're much more detailed than these numbers over here. And the reason for that being is a 200 millimeter will compress, or it will give you a shallower depth of field.
Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about that last episode.
We
also.
did.
Mhm.
I think we will get into that topic with more visual aids and stuff like that on a coming episode, because I think we can show a lot of examples on how different in the compression and
Yeah.
different depth of field.
I think we should dedicate one day to lenses, in a sense, rather
Yeah.
than crop factor and what it does mean.
Definitely.
Yes, but here what they did is, these are two images. The bottom one is actually cropped to match the view.
Mhm.
The only
It
way
could also just have been shot on Micro Four Thirds camera and it would have been the same result.
It
that
says
is
crop,
100%.
right?
Yeah.
Or? Yeah.
But what Zivi said is exactly accurate, and it's like
Mhm.
sum up the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
because this is a 200 millimeter and this is a 100 millimeter, and they're exactly half.
Half.
So, or
Two times.
2 times. It depends which way you're going. So if you're going down, it's half. If you're going up, it's twice as much. And oh, thanks, Janet, for posting it on the chat. It's clear for everybody.
Yep.
So you can see that the depth of field is a bit wider on the bottom image, meaning more stuff are in focus
Mm-hmm.
than on the top image. And as Zivi mentioned, the bottom one could have been shot with or the top one, sorry, could have been shot with the same lens, a different camera, Micro Four Thirds. And that's basically why a lot of people struggle getting bokeh on smaller cameras.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, your iPhone has a portrait mode.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it has a 1.8 lens, it needs that portrait mode, that computational photography that will detect the foreground and the background and will
Make it blurry. Yeah.
make add a layer of blur basically
That's
on,
what it does. Yeah.
on the background.
Yep.
Mhm.
Because the sensor cannot achieve the sensor size cannot, well, not the sensor size, but the lens on that sensor doesn't achieve the same type of compression or the
Mhm.
lack of compression, I must say, to allow
Well,
for
you
bokeh.
you don't have as large of an image. Like it's physically not as large, so the effect of the depth of field, you just won't see as much of it, so it will look like it's not blurry in the background, while it actually is. You just can't really see it.
Do you mean that the way the light spreads on a bigger sensor?
No, the way that you just see more of it, and the fact that with a larger field of view, you'll need to be closer to the subject, and when the lens is focused closer to something, the depth of field gets
Changes.
shallower.
Yeah, that's the relation between the three things that are the sensor and the subject and the background, right? So what Zivi is saying that if you need to create more depth of field, you need to get closer to your subject. So you need to have the distance between the camera and the subject smaller than the distance between the subject and the background.
That also, yeah.
And with what you're saying is basically that because the phone camera is very small, or the phone sensor is very small, it needs a very kind of wide lens to give you a wide enough field of view to be a natural lens.
Phone lenses, the standard lens is usually something like 28 millimeters.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's like a 4.3 millimeter, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And some phones have a wider lens or a tighter lens. And those are like 5 millimeters for the tighter one. Or 6 something, and 3 for the wider one.
Right. And basically with that stuff, you need to kind of get super close.
Yeah.
In order to have the same depth of field, which becomes
a macro.
Unrealistic at what you're seeing and how you're trying to take a photo of it because of the size limitation.
Yeah.
Right. All right. So I think we have a second example. Here we have a full frame sensor photo and an APS-C sensor photo. One is shot with 150 millimeter and one is shot with 100 millimeter. What's the difference between these two in terms of how they did match them? I'm trying to find something.
Find the 7 differences.
Well, it's sort of the same as the pictures before. It's just not as apparent because the crop factor difference isn't as large.
Well, I can tell you this thing as well. They have different apertures. So the one on the top is f8.
Oh yeah, this is to match the depth of field.
Yeah. So you can see that on a smaller sensor, you need to be wider to create the same blurry background, let's say. But also there is a thing where this one is using 100 millimeter and this one is using 150 millimeter. So that kind of, I think, adds to the fact that it's positioned differently.
What they're trying to do is match the image.
Yes.
From a full frame and an APS-C sensor. So you need a tighter lens or a wider lens, depending on which way you're going, and you need a different aperture.
All right. So let's say here, in this case, we started with the full frame photo. We took a photo with f8 at 150 millimeter, and it looked exactly like you're seeing. In order to match it, we needed to have a wider field of view lens. That's why we used the 100 millimeter instead of 150. And I'm assuming they placed it exactly at the same place on the same tripod.
Yeah, it should be.
And instead of using f8, we had to switch back to drop it down to f5. That way we can create more depth of field. Because, as we mentioned, is that if the two lenses are in the same place or the two cameras are in the same place, well, it's so hard to explain when I don't have it prepared. I'm losing. Can somebody else explain it than me?
CV?
Help. Everybody's stopping out.
Well, the thing is that when you want to match from two different sensor sizes, because of all the things that we explained earlier with crop factor and how that affects lenses, but it doesn't affect the focal length of the lens. The focal length of the lens is the lens's thing.
It's fixed. Yeah, it's always going to be.
But there is the crop factor difference. So when when you want to get the same field of view, which is, I think that's a slide we skipped with the
Mm-hmm.
that showed the angles.
Yeah,
Um,
there's
Go back
another
to
one.
like
Yeah.
yeah, that kind of shows the angle of view
Yeah.
of the lens itself. Well, when you have a larger or smaller sensor, you're just going to see more or less of that.
Yeah, exactly.
And that affects background blur too.
Yes, and that's big.
Well, it doesn't actually affect background blur. It just affects the way that you see it.
Yeah, it affects the depth of field because it affects how compressed or not compressed you will see the background, basically.
It affects effective depth of field,
Yeah.
not actual depth of field.
Mm-hmm.
The actual depth of field of these two images is the same because one is focused further away than the other.
Mm-hmm.
Because depth of field is independent of field of view.
I think in this case, they're about the same. I don't think they move the camera; they just move the crop factor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. The
they-
camera's in the same place.
yeah, and they're focused at the same distance. It's just that
It's a different lens.
yeah, I understand it's a different lens, but it's still sitting at the same lenses. We're just changing the crop.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, so when it is a different lens, one will be focused closer than the other,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, because
like in relation to the focal length,
yeah,
I suppose.
that's true because you kind of have to estimate on because the thing that I forgot to mention is that when you talk about the focal center of a lens
Mm-hmm.
is when the lens is focused at infinity.
Yeah, that's true.
So because that focal point will shift back and forth. So if I go up to this slide, here it says infinity distance to very far object. So this focal
infinity
point,
isn't actually infinity.
Zivi, let's not get too complicated. But let's say this
It's
is
a scam, all right?
all right. Wait, hold on. I think I have a. You want to tell us more about this guy? The conspiracy of the infinity focus, brought to you by PLC.
But let's talk about that again when we talk about lenses.
All right. So here, this is the furthest. This is an example of your lens focused the furthest it can go. So with physical limitations, this element of the lens
Mm-hmm.
will not be able to go any closer to the sensor.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh
that's
wait, I can show this.
and that's as far as this thing can go in terms of focus. So it's focusing on the most distant object. Let's say you're focusing on the stars or the moon. This is going to be very far. You're going to be close to infinity. Maybe you have to pull it back and
A
not
little
a
bit.
little
Mhm.
bit to focus on the moon, for example. All right, what's the CV showing us? We can't see.
Let's put it in the other view where we are the three of us, so it's a bit
Alright.
bigger. Nice. So she is showing.
So
Explain what you're showing.
this is my macro lens,
Yeah. And when you
Uh,
focus, it will get very long.
which it's fully manual.
Mm-hmm.
And the length of the actual lens doesn't actually change.
Oh,
But
Well-
because it has a filter thing on the front that I don't really want to take off because it gets dirty.
it's all right. I think I can visualize
If
this.
you can see when it's focused all the way to 2:1, you can sort of see inside of it. You
That is
can
getting
see
closer.
that
Yeah.
there's the front element of the actual lens.
Uh-huh.
When I focus away, it disappears into it.
There. Sorry, I was indicating where is one thing that we're gonna show. Yes. So yeah, so you can see how the elements inside the lens are moving forwards and backwards to change the focusing.
And you should also be able to see that the stuff that you can see on the other side of the lens is flipped upside down.
Yeah,
Yes.
because of how
And
the
that's
lens
because of this convergence point.
exactly.
All right. So this is a macro lens. This is less fancy because it moves. And so now here there's a toggle where it can be in full macro mode or in limited macro mode. So let's say you want to walk around and use it as normal lens, you put it in limit. And if you want to use it as macro, you put it in full. I don't know if you can see it. You can probably see it. Now, this is a prime lens, so it doesn't zoom. It only focuses. And if I want to focus, I turn this around, and you can see how much it extends to allow for macro focusing. So this tube is housing all the elements inside the lens, and they're all moving forward. You can see on the back, there's one element that is stuck to the back, but the rest of it basically is just moving around. Hold on, I can show you. It's on a very narrow aperture. Now I opened it. Hold on, like this. And as Zivi was showing you, basically everything is moving. So you can see here, because you can see the tube extend out. And what's happening is that the focal center of this lens is moving from somewhere around here all the way here. And in that, when you do that, if we look back on the projector or presentation, you can see that this point right here is the closest it can be to the sensor. But if we want to focus further, this is gonna move forward, and the focus point is gonna get closer.
Yep.
Right? I forgot how we got on this subject.
Because we were talking about the depth of field, that the focal length is actually given by the distance between the focal point and the sensor when the lens is focusing on infinity.
Right. So infinity focus is all the way in the back, and then it gets closer. Now, this is a common thing, I think, with what do you call it? Zoom lenses. For example, I know for a fact that this zoom lens that I have can focus pretty closely when I have it on a, let's say, 40 millimeter, which is the widest it can go. But then if I zoom in, this is all zoom. If I zoom into this much, the closest thing I can focus on has to fall back. And a reason for that is...
but that's really because the converging point is changing the distance.
Place.
Yes, and this is actually Cedric was mentioning in the chat, very well pointed, that phone cameras are really good to take photos of miniatures because the lens is really, really close to the sensor, and then you can focus really, really close, like taking a photo of a miniature. So there you can see the relationship between the focal length, the actual focal length of the lens, how physically close your lens is to your sensor, and then how close you can actually focus.
Interesting. So yeah, I guess, do we have any interesting questions in the chat?
There is quite quiet tonight.
No questions?
Maybe people are waiting to then join and ask questions live.
All right.
To conclude, we should talk about some of this stuff in practice.
All right.
More than all of these weird theoretical things with film formats and long focal lengths and things. So what is this actually useful for outside of just calculating a focal length? In the example that you mentioned before, Eva, I would personally say that buying larger lenses than you need in case of wanting to upgrade. Yeah. Because like you mentioned earlier, usually the higher end bodies have full frame sensors and the lower end and mid-range bodies have APS-C sized sensors. But what a lot of camera companies will do is have their first party lenses be compatible on both APS-C and full frame sized.
Yeah, so I think given, of course, in every case you have to see what budget do you have to spend on lenses. But if you are able to afford a lens that is compatible with both bodies, you are basically putting a little bit of an investment, because you might change down the line your body and you will still be able to use your lens, which is what didn't happen to me when I had my 30mm lens in my Canon.
Mhm.
I upgraded. I was like, it basically is rendered useless. You have to sell it. So rather, I personally would maybe look for a good shape second-hand lens that would fit both an APS-C and a full-frame sensor, even if I have an APS-C camera, because I know that at some point I might be able to use it with a full-frame camera.
So I think I often hear people saying, I'm gonna get a Canon Rebel, for example, instead of, let's say, a Nikon DX, or like, the D1000 lines, instead of getting a Micro Four Thirds camera, because I want to be able to continue using the same system when I upgrade to a full frame. And I often think that this is not necessarily a great
strategy
to do, because, well, the first thing is that if you, let's say, get a 50mm 1.8 with a D3000, and you go around and you shoot it for a year or two, you're going to be used to that 50mm feel on the 1.8, which is going to be, as we said earlier, about maybe 75mm view when you go. So when you switch to your full frame camera, it's going to be a lot wider than when you're used to on your crop sensor camera. And if you go for the crop sensor because it's cheaper, well, then you're going to get cheaper lenses. So if you're on a very limited budget, you're going with a limited budget with the lenses as well. And then, okay, so you're using a lens that is made for that body. You bring it up to your full frame camera and you're going to have the problem that Eva showed you, where you have black circle around, you have a heavy vignetting around your image. So I think a good takeaway from here is that maybe this is not the best strategy to go about saying, okay, I'm going to get a crop sensor Canon lens, Canon camera, because I want to upgrade for a full frame one in the future when I can afford. I would say get whatever camera you can afford, right? But that upgrade factor is not a factor. It's not you're not really being consistent in that. You're either going to have to pay for an expensive lens that you can keep for when you get your full frame body, or you're going to get a cheaper lens that is not going to work with your full frame body, or you're going to get a lens that will be like the Nifty 50 is about €100, $100 ish. But then you're going to be walking around shooting with a 75mm, which is a lot tighter than what you will see on your full frame camera. And I think the other thing is these lenses that are made for full frame, they're like, let's say, okay, well, what I can do is get a 35mm lens like you did. And that 35mm lens is, if you get it for a full frame sensor, it's going to be expensive. 35mm 1.8 are not cheap. And it's going to give you approximately the same feel as a 50mm. But then again, when you jump, it's going to look wider. You're going to be walking around with 35mm. And so I think I think that argument where you think, okay, I'm going to get into Canon Rebel line because I want to be able to get to the upgrade to the full frame line and I want to have my lenses, I don't think that's a very solid strategy to go by.
I mean, yeah, because once you change, even if your lenses are working, you are really changing your working field of view and your working focal length.
Yes.
So you will have to adjust to that. So either you adjust to the way you work, or if you have different lenses that are for crop factor, then for crop sensor, then you just have to buy new lenses and then get the same equivalents as well. Cedric here is saying in the chat, if you're gonna get APS-C but get full frame lenses and then work with that. He's saying, for example,
That's what I did.
For APS-C, get a 50mm 1.8. It's an 80 equivalent, but it's still very good for portraits. And then you're going to have that lens that will become a 50 effective when you upgrade to full frame.
Yeah, I mean, you could always crop your images up.
It is what I did.
Yeah.
My first nice lens that I bought, I started with a Canon 80D that came with two lenses, a 51.8 and an 85 to 135 kit lens. And the first nice lens that I bought was a secondhand 100mm macro
Mm-hmm.
that I sold it 2 months ago. Only time I've ever felt sentimental about a piece of tech.
Yeah. And I think this visualization on the screen is a good thing to keep in mind. Like everybody take a screenshot of this
Mm-hmm.
just to understand that when you're getting into buying a different lens for this is how much is going to be different, and it's a
Yeah.
significant difference
It
between
is.
the APS-C and the full frame.
I mean, I think
It's
this
quite big.
actually leads us to the second point when it comes to practical issues, or like why knowing this is also important.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because depending the kind of photography you like doing the most, you might be more prone to get a micro four thirds sensor versus a full frame sensor. And Janet is, like she is now pointing out, micro four thirds for zoom lenses
Mm-hmm.
is very good.
Mhm.
And this is because of the crop factor that we were talking before. So if you want to shoot things that are really far away, very long lenses in full frame are really, really expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a micro four thirds camera that has a 2 times crop factor, then getting a 150mm lens
Mm-hmm.
that is relatively cheaper, you can actually have an effective field of view that is equivalent to a 300mm in a full frame, which is a really expensive lens.
Yeah, like this one, for example, goes up to 300mm. Look how tiny it is.
So if you
It's
like
the same thing that we talked about earlier.
Mhm.
Yeah, so if you are, for example, a person that looks shooting birds or animals far away, maybe going for a medium, like a micro four thirds camera would
Mhm.
make more sense, because you are going to be able to invest in lenses that you can use for good zooming
Mhm.
much cheaper than on a full frame. On the other hand, if you like landscapes, if you like very wide angles of view,
Mhm.
then if you have a crop sensor,
It's
it's gonna
gonna
be
be-
harder for you to get that very wide field of view without having to buy expensive lenses.
Very expensive.
Because the wider the lens, the more expensive it is to make it and to make it work properly. And
You,
to be,
you hit
to
a
be
certain
good.
threshold.
Yeah.
Like once you go down
You're
below.
gonna have to get one of these things, which is really freaking expensive.
Yeah, well, in order to get like a decent wide, like a proper ultra wide on a micro four thirds, you're gonna have to go to 7mm lenses.
Yeah.
And these are crazy. Like they're
This is
gonna,
a 24
yeah.
uh,
So that's
on,
like a
on full frame, and there it is possible, like physically possible, to have a 1.4 aperture. On micro four thirds, that's just not a thing.
No, it doesn't fit.
No. Mm-hmm.
Like it's physically impossible to have a 7mm 1.4 lens.
Yeah, and I think equivalent to
12
that
too.
it will be 12mm.
Yeah.
I have a 14, a 2.5 lens. I know I was actually looking them up yesterday, but I don't remember what I found. But I know that there are a wide micro four thirds. I think Janet can help me. Yes, 8mm 1.8. It exists.
It exists.
And it's probably cost 2 kidneys and a liver.
and a dead body.
How much does it cost?
I'm gonna check.
Not that much, but then probably the quality is not. There's 500 euros for 8mm 1.8. It is awesome. Does it have
important thing.
autofocus? No autofocus. Am I right?
I mean, $1,000. I'm seeing here the Olympus.
With
M2 Go.
autofocus. Can we get one? Order up. Put it in the cart. I need it for my vlogs that are.
Didn't you say you don't like wide?
No, but I tried vlogging the other day, and even with a 14mm,
It's still,
It's
you
still
need
too
some,
close.
Yeah.
especially because when I record in 4K, it crops even more.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, I've tried for fun just holding up my camera, and I think because I'm short, 24 works well.
You know what I have? I have right now a 400mm full frame lens. Do you guys want me to slap it on the micro four thirds and see what we can see?
I think we are not gonna see anything unless you put it out the window or something.
I mean, yeah, I can point it out the window. Vote in the chat. Do you want to see what it looks like? If you're listening to this show, I mean, you definitely have to come join us and watch it because it's
Janet is saying yes, and Dad says yes, and Neuro says
everybody
yes.
is voting.
And
All right.
Bambi is, of course, my dude.
All right. You guys keep the conversation going. I'm
All
going
right.
to try to go set it up.
All right.
Actually, that we can do something that we didn't do, which is getting to know Sivi a little bit more, because we have introduced ourselves in the previous episode. We got to know Janet as
Oh,
well, but
heck.
we don't know Sivi so much. So, Sivi, can you tell us what is your relationship with photography at the moment?
At the moment, I have some mixed feelings about it. We've had a bit. We've had some disagreements.
Photography and you?
Mainly Lightroom and I. I've
Oh.
had to recreate my entire Lightroom library recently.
Ooh, that sounds
Which
like a lot
was-
of work, actually.
That was a lot of work.
But then let's rephrase the question and say, how
It
did you
took
get
about
into?
3 seasons of Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Whoa. How did you get into photography?
I started a lot of time ago with my dad's camera. I didn't really take it seriously at the beginning, but I definitely blame that for me actually being able to tell the difference between sensor sizes and liking full frame, because the first camera I actually shot on was a 5D Mark II.
Oh, you are a little spoiled.
Very, very spoiled. And with the same 100mm macro that I then bought later. So I think
Mhm.
that's why I love the look so much.
Look what Jimmy's showing. It's a crazy lens. It looks more like a telescope, to be honest.
It's chunky. Jeez. Is
Did they?
that a full...
I think
What
he
aperture
actually
is that
he went
thing?
to a wedding once with this camera, with this lens.
Oh yeah, I did. I had to like stand in the kitchen to take photos of the people on the dance floor.
Was the wedding in
It was a
another
big
country?
venue, and I
In another
couldn't, I
country.
couldn't, I couldn't fit. It was, I had to be so far away.
She's like, "Was the wedding in another country?"
I mean, it might have been actually. It's crazy. And I was shooting it with a 5D, so I was shooting on a full frame.
Yeah. So
Oh, wow.
no extra equivalency. Let's see what people are saying in the chat. So that was your beginners, and then from using that very good camera, what did you move into? What was your next working camera?
Before you answer that,
I
sorry, you guys are gonna keep the conversation going, but people on the screen are gonna be seeing a completely different thing, because I'm gonna have to take the view of Eva to use this camera that is filming her, to show you
Yeah.
the field of view of this.
So I'll be gone, but we keep talking. All right. Tell me, Sibi.
Yeah.
Tell us.
So I didn't shoot a lot at the beginning because of reasons and time and stuff, and I was not super old, so just letting me run around with expensive camera stuff wasn't really ideal. But some years later, I then got my own camera. Well, actually, it was technically my mum bought it, but I used it. The Canon 80D that I mentioned. That was 4 years ago, I think. And that's when I started taking photography a bit more seriously. I started trying to actually take nice images and such. I did a lot of sort of experimenting with product photography at the beginning. A lot of things that I've rediscovered now that I had to recreate my Lightroom library.
So you have about 4 years of worth of photos to kind of restructure in your Lightroom library. I would say.
Yeah, there should be around 70,000.
It's product photography still one of your main things today?
Not really. The main thing is nature photography. Mainly based on the fact that I've had to sort my nature photography collection into separate years and separate seasons. So there's a lot of that.
And so now, when we applying your experience to the things that we were talking today, what is your preferred, let's say, focal length for your landscape photography, or your preferred focal length for your product photography?
100 mil.
For both.
Yes.
All right, so you're a 100 mil gal.
Yeah, I mean, now I guess 135.
135. Okay.
Yeah, because I got myself a new lens.
Mm-hmm.
But with that 100 mil macro lens that I mentioned, which was the first nice lens I bought,
Mm-hmm.
I've taken the vast majority of my pictures.
All right, that's. I think that's a very nice approach. Yeah, we were saying that maybe a lot of us had a lot of gear acquisition syndrome, but I think it's very nice to have one piece of equipment that you kind of exploit to the max, and you really learn
Yeah,
what the limitations and what the advantages of that particular piece of gear are. So in your case, you have this lens that you've been using for two completely different ways of photography.
yeah. I mean, it became a joke kind of at a point with some other photography friends where I would literally shoot anything with that lens. I've shot astro with my macro lens.
Oh, and how did that go?
Well, for a composite that from Venice, I've used that macro lens.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, if you go into my portfolio, the last many pictures are taken with that.
Yeah, so
The composite with the stars in Venice. The stars in that picture I shot with the macro lens.
yeah, so you guys, if you want to check that out, then you can go to the portfolio in the site. Jimmy is pointing me out to tell you what's happening right now in the thing that you are seeing, which is quite shaky. So he just put a huge, crazy lens in a very tiny micro four thirds camera, which is the Olympus EM OM EM10. So it's quite small.
Can you hit the cut button so they see how I'm holding it?
Yes, I can. Which one is this?
Cut.
Are-
Says cut.
I can see
The first one.
here,
That one, big one.
here.
Yeah. So this is what's happening.
It's not showing fully, but they can see it a little
It's
bit.
supposed to be mounted here, so it lifts the camera.
Yeah.
Can you say that?
It's supposed to be mounted in that place that he's actually showing, but it's actually mounted on the camera because that's how we had it. So he has to hold it because it's very heavy and it will basically, I think, wreck apart the mount.
Hit cut again.
Okay, I hit cut.
So I'm gonna now.
It's a 400 mil.
Yeah.
It's a 400 mil on a crop sensor in a micro four thirds, so it's actually a 800 equivalent.
Alright, and I'm gonna now switch back to the 35mm.
It's gonna change now to the 35mm in the same position in the same camera, and that was scary to look at. So he's basically now putting the 35mm back, and basically what you see, he has to bring down the exposure because it's much bigger aperture, of course. He was a 6400 ISO, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Now we're back. So basically, what you're seeing there, like if you can take away the menu. Yeah, so this is now a 35mm. Actually, it's a 70mm equivalent in that body. But what you are seeing there, can you point with your finger exactly where we were seeing? So it's basically that area there, and that's how much the change from a 70 to a 800 is.
We were only seeing that street sign all the way over there.
It's a fun thing. It would look super weird to go out and shoot with that lens in that body, though.
I will show you. Yeah, I could show you this one.
He is gonna show how the zoom lens.
Can you switch back to me?
Yes, I can. So he's gonna put now.
All right, so now I'm gonna show you the difference. This is the 400 that I was using to show you that street sign. This one is a 14 to 150 millimeter lens, and look at the size difference. I mean, you saw what it looks like with a 400 millimeter, which was effectively 800 millimeter. But now we're gonna see what the 150 looks like.
Cut. it's I was gonna say it's black completely, but yeah. This is how a sensor with no lens looks like for all of you.
It looks like pain.
Yeah. And now it's basically the zoom lens is to put the ISO a little bit higher, I would say.
A lot higher.
Yeah. It's basically night, deep night. Maybe there, yeah. No, yeah. And then basically, so that's actually zoom in as much as possible is 100 what? How much? 150. And it's 150 times 2.
Yeah.
So it's a 300 full frame equivalent.
Yeah. But it's not the same as getting close to the 400 that was on. Not to be confused.
No.
Because that was an 800.
100 full frame equivalent.
Yeah.
So you still have a lot to go from this 300 to 800.
Yes.
I think we did a very good in-depth look into what focal length means and crop size and crop sensor and the relationship between them. I hope that it was clear for the people still listening to us.
To be honest, when we were planning this thing, I was skeptical at the fact that we were going to be able to fill an entire podcast with this.
Sorry. She said, Zivi saying, no, you're listening. Okay, yeah. Sorry, you have the headphone.
I was honestly very skeptical, but here we go.
This is what I always tell Jimmy when we prepare a podcast. Is like, when you think it's not enough for half a podcast, it's going to be 1.5 podcasts, actually. There is a lot to talk. There is a lot of interesting things and quirks and knowledge as well. That is very nice to have if you want to really like go deep into photography. I think most of us here are somewhat self-taught, and
I'm completely self-taught.
When I started, it was, I wouldn't say super hard, but of course it was another time. The internet wasn't working the same way it is now. But I kind of wish to have had, a community and a place like this to learn with people and have access to a lot of resources as well. So I think you guys are in the fast track, I think.
I hope you guys enjoyed that demonstration because it was terrifying to me.
It was
indeed. I felt your pain. I felt it.
I think Cedric left a nice summary, but we all know that I can't read. So if can somebody read it out loud for the people listening somewhere else, if they're still alive with us on the show?
There is still like a whooping 8 people with us, apart from us, I would say. So that's nice.
I mean, that's way more people than usually listen to me talk, so.
Get used to it, Sivi. I think we should probably be wrapping up now for this part, and then we continue the fun in the stages for those that want to now talk and ask questions and just share things. What do you say, Jimmy?
Right. Yeah, I mean, if you guys are satisfied with this episode, you think we covered everything. We didn't get any questions, unlike last episode. Last time it was happening.
Yeah, also there were a lot of questions that were a little bit out from the topic we were talking about, so maybe, I don't know, but I think maybe we were like super clear.
Maybe we were. Let's assume that.
Let's just assume that, yeah.
All right, you guys. Thank you so much for being with us.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Zivi, for joining us today. It was really fun.
Mm-hmm.
Very informative. We really could have made it without you, especially in some parts where I was completely blanking out. So it's really fun. We hope you enjoyed it and that you're down to join us again on another episode. And everybody who's listening and watching, thank you so much. We most of all hope you guys enjoyed it and found it informative or at least entertaining. Now what's going to happen is that for those of you live, we're going to jump into the post-show Q&A. You can find it under your names there in the chat. We will be there very shortly.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you watching elsewhere, well, maybe come and join us on Discord. Find the links in the description or show notes or whatever this platform has links. And we'll see you on the next one. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.